Hey everyone, Pastor Caleb here. Thank you for joining me for another daily devotion. We're in John chapter 12 today. Apologize for getting this out a little bit late. I had an eye doctor appointment this morning, and then I recorded this whole devotion, and then my computer didn't save it. So here we are. We're still getting it done, and God's word is still true. So God be praised that He still lets this get out into the world. We're doing John 12, 1 to 11 today. If you want to follow along, I got the text in the description of the video and in the description of the podcast. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected, "Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages." He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. "Leave her alone," Jesus replied. "It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me." Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and came not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well, for on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and believing in him. This is the gospel of the Lord. So the situation is that everybody's at Mary and Martha's house, and Martha is serving, and Lazarus is hanging out with the guys, it seems. And Mary comes in, and then she lets her hair down. She gets on her knees, she starts breaking this jar. We find out she actually breaks the jar in another gospel account, and she pours it on Jesus' head and feet, and then she wipes his feet with her hair. So let's just talk about that interaction for a moment. First of all, what's the deal with this big thing of perfume that Judas tells us in his quote is worth a year's wages? I mean, just think about that for a second. Like, how much money do you make in a year? It's quite a bit, right? So why does she have this thing, first of all? And then why does she do what she does? Well, it seems that because there was no banking system in Jesus' time, that families would hang on to wealth and pass it on from generation to generation in the form of assets. So you would spend your money on something very expensive, usually small, so that it could be transported and handed down easily, so that if a future generation has trouble with finances, they can sell this financial heirloom and save themselves from financial ruin, basically. So it seems that Mary and Martha and Lazarus had this jar that was probably passed down to them from their parents, and they were keeping it as sort of a financial security, right? Well, Mary breaks it, like doesn't just use some of it, like smashes the whole thing so that she can put it on Jesus. Now, obviously this rubs some people the wrong way, right? Judas says right here that he doesn't like it. He has ulterior motives, of course, but he doesn't like it. And the other gospel accounts of this story tell us that there were actually more than just Judas who didn't like what was happening. Why is that? Well, John tells us that Judas had ulterior motives, but as we think about why Judas might be irritated by this and why other people might be irritated by this, I think it's because of the extremeness of this worship. They look at what Mary does and they say, that doesn't seem like it makes sense. Like, I like Jesus as much as the next guy, but man, a year's wages? Breaking that family heirloom? Why would you do that? And what that helps us understand is the extreme nature of worship that Jesus is calling us to. Just think about how Mary comes to him and worships. She worships first by getting down on her knees, by putting herself in the position of a servant, which is what Jesus calls us to do. Not to be those who see him as our assistant to help us accomplish our goals and get somewhere in our life, but that we would see ourselves as wholly committed to doing what is good for him and for his kingdom, that we see ourselves not as working for our own good, but as working for the good of him and for others. She lets her hair down so that she can wipe his feet with her hair. We still have the phrase, let your hair down, in English. We understand it as a kind of form of vulnerability or sort of letting go of your inhibitions and not caring what people think about you, right? It's exactly what Mary was doing. But in her culture, it would have been even more extreme. More than likely, the only person who would see a woman let her hair down was her husband. And we don't know if Mary was married. It seems that she wasn't because she's living with Martha and Lazarus. But if she was, that was probably the only person who would have ever seen her let her hair down. And she lets it down in front of Jesus. And then she takes possibly the most valuable thing in her possession, more than likely the most valuable thing in her possession, and she destroys it for the sake of worshiping Jesus. Wow, what does that say about our worship life? Are we first and foremost concerned with doing what is good for God and for his kingdom? Or are we more concerned about doing what's good for us and for our kingdom? And then if we have extra time or extra money or extra energy, we'll give it to Jesus' kingdom. Are we more concerned with making sure we have a house that's nice to live in than making sure God has a house that's good for worship? Are we more concerned with driving around a certain type of car? Or more concerned with making sure that our pastor is taken care of, the poor people in our congregation are taken care of, the poor people in our community are taken care of? Are we more concerned with living a certain lifestyle? Or making sure that people who don't know Jesus can have an eternal lifestyle? See, I think very often our problem is we see Jesus as something that is nice to have, but is not worth our full devotion. To borrow the metaphor from this story, we like to dab the perfume of Jesus on us sometimes to cover up some of our less savory parts, but we don't want Jesus to be fully in control of everything that we are and everything that we do. We don't want to become vulnerable to him, because if we're vulnerable, that means we have to listen. That means that who we are is ultimately identified with him. And I fear that this doesn't just have a bad effect on our relationship with other people or the way that we live our life, but I actually think it is fundamentally a messed up relationship with Jesus. You get vulnerable with somebody you know. Not just because you should, but because you want to. But if you don't know a person, you don't get vulnerable with them. You're scared to get vulnerable with them. Let me ask you, are you ready to let Jesus have control of your finances? Are you ready to have Jesus take control of your lifestyle? Are you ready to have Jesus take control of how you plan your days, where you work, when you work? If you're scared of that, it might be because you don't know Jesus. You might know about Jesus, but you don't know Jesus. Because if you knew him, you would want to get vulnerable. You'd want to let your hair down. You'd want to throw away all your inhibitions and follow what he is calling you to. Then finally, think about that jar of pure nard. What's the thing that you don't want Jesus to touch? Is it your money? Is it the way you live? Is it the way you parent? Is it that sin that you don't really want to stop doing? Or that good thing that has become an idol in your life? Smash it. And if you're not ready to smash it, maybe you need to hear what Jesus is willing to smash for you. He was willing to smash his own body. He was willing to give up his own life. He was willing to take his God life and put it inside human flesh so that he could be eternally connected to us and we could be eternally connected to him, not because we earned it or deserved it or because we were so devoted to him, but because he was so devoted to us. He was so vulnerable for us. A good way to test if you become vulnerable with Jesus is to see what other people say about you. Think about Judas and the people in this story. They were indignant. Really? You're going to let your hair down and break that jar of pure nard? So many better things could be done with it. Our worship ought to be so extreme that people see us and notice that we're doing something extreme. Now, I'm not saying that we should get wacky, but I am saying that we should be different. And not just on Sunday morning, but every day of the week, because our worship is not just 1 hour on Sunday. Every moment of our life is a spiritual act of worship, is what Paul says in Romans 12. Does every moment of your life cause people to think there's something a little bit weird about them? It might lead to criticism, like Mary got, or like Lazarus, who was threatened with death. But when you find out what Jesus has done for you, you'll be willing to do it. See what Jesus says in his answer? He says to Lazarus, or to Judas Iscariot, he says, "It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial." You understand what he's saying? See, what she understands, Judas, is that her identity, her eternity, her every moment of the rest of her life is tied into the fact that I am going to die and I'm going to rise again, and she believes that. Because if she didn't believe that, she would save this for the day of my burial, because that would mean that I was dead and gone, but I am not going to be dead and gone. I'm coming back. Which is why she poured it on me now, while I'm alive, where it can be useful, where it can be worshipful. Judas, if you understood that I was coming back to life, or you, person watching this video, if you understand Jesus is coming back to life, you will look at Mary's act and hear and say, that's what I want to worship like. Look at what Jesus says next. He says, the poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. In other words, he says, don't spend your time trying to make things happen in this world if you don't have me. And once you do, once you have me, you'll be super effective in this world, because I will unleash you to do actual good for the sake of other people. I pray that that works deep into your heart, brothers and sisters. Your natural propensity as a North American person is to believe that you are an individual and you make your own choices and you make your own path and you are who you want to be, and no one can tell you otherwise, and you better not trust anybody else because they might mess it up for you. But what being a Christian means is being vulnerable to Jesus, who has died in your place so that you can eternally live with him and with the Father and the Holy Spirit forever. So be effective in this world by giving up what you have for the sake of his kingdom that lasts forever. I pray that that works, because I know it worked for Mary, and I know that God's word can work for you too. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure that you click on the videos that we got on the screen so you can see some other things that we've been up to.